When they opened the Footlocker buried for 60 years in the Bavarian forest, Private Jimmy Sullivan's final diary entry was still legible. They think I'll keep quiet, but I won't let them steal from the victims. The 19-year-old soldier from Boston had discovered millions in stolen Nazi treasure and was murdered by his own officers to silence him, but his hidden documentation would finally expose the conspiracy that had concealed his fate since 1945. The morning sun filtered through the skeletal branches of bombed-out trees as Private First Class Jimmy Sullivan sat on his helmet, using it as a makeshift chair while he wrote what would become his final letter home. Around him, the remnants of Nazi Germany's once mighty war machine lay scattered across the Bavarian countryside like broken toys discarded by a petulant child. Burned-out panzer tanks dotted the fields, their steel hulks already beginning to rust in the spring rain. Jimmy's pencil moved carefully across the thin paper, each word chosen with the knowledge that military censors would read every line before it reached his mother's hands in South Boston. He had learned to say everything and nothing at the same time, a skill that came from months of writing letters under the watchful eye of Army regulations. "Dear Ma," he began, the same way he had started every letter since landing at Normandy nearly a year ago. "The boys and I are doing fine. The weather here in Germany is getting warmer, and we can smell spring in the air. I hope you got my last letter and that Patrick is keeping up with his studies. Tell him his big brother is proud of him, and that he better not even think about enlisting until this whole mess is over." Jimmy paused, chewing on the eraser of his pencil as he considered his next words. There was so much he wanted to tell her, so much he couldn't say. Yesterday, while on patrol with Corporal Martinez and 2 other boys from his squad, they had stumbled upon something that made his stomach turn and his hands shake with anger. A hidden bunker, carefully concealed beneath fallen timber and brush, containing more wealth than Jimmy had ever seen in his 19 years of life. Gold bars stacked like cordwood, paintings in ornate frames wrapped in protective cloth, jewelry that sparkled even in the dim light of their flashlights, and documents, lots of documents, written in German script that none of them could read but which carried the unmistakable stamp of official Nazi business. Tony Martinez had whistled low and long when they realized what they were looking at. "Jesus, Jimmy, this stuff must be worth millions." But it was more than just the money that bothered Jimmy. As the son of Irish immigrants who had faced their own share of discrimination in Boston, he understood what it meant when powerful people took things from those who couldn't fight back. This wasn't German government gold or Nazi party funds. This was stolen property, ripped from the hands of families who had been dragged from their homes and sent to places like the camp they had liberated just days ago at Dachau. "I found something interesting today that the brass needs to know about," Jimmy wrote carefully. The censors would let that through. It was vague enough to pass inspection, but specific enough that his mother would know he was dealing with something important. "Can't say much more about it, but it's the kind of thing that makes you remember why we're here fighting in the first place." Jimmy looked up from his letter as Sergeant O'Brien called out orders for the afternoon patrol. The 42nd Infantry Division was pushing toward the Austrian border, mopping up scattered German resistance and securing territory for the occupation forces that would follow. It was dangerous work, but nothing like the hell they had endured during the winter months. The German army was collapsing, but desperate men with nothing left to lose could still be deadly. "I should be home soon, Ma," Jimmy continued writing. "Mary sent me a picture of herself in that blue dress I like, and I keep it right here in my breast pocket next to my heart. When I get back to Boston, I'm going to marry that girl and give you the grandchildren you keep asking about. We'll buy a little house somewhere near the harbor where I can hear the ships coming in, just like when I was a kid." He signed the letter, "Your loving son, Jimmy," and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, 1247 Dorchester Avenue, South Boston, Massachusetts. That afternoon, during what should have been a routine security patrol near the village where they were bivouacked, Private First Class James Sullivan would walk into the German countryside and vanish from the face of the earth, leaving behind only questions that would haunt his family for the next 60 years. Sergeant Mike O'Brien had been checking his watch every 10 minutes since 4 o'clock, and now the sun was starting to disappear behind the rolling hills of the Bavarian countryside. Jimmy Sullivan should have been back from his perimeter check 2 hours ago. In the 42nd Infantry Division, you didn't just wander off without word, especially not when you were this close to the end of the war and everyone wanted to make it home alive. O'Brien had been Sullivan's squad leader since they landed in France, and he knew the kid's habits better than anyone. Jimmy was the kind of soldier every sergeant hoped for, reliable as clockwork and smart enough to stay out of trouble. He didn't drink like some of the boys, didn't chase after German girls, and never complained about the cold rations or sleeping in muddy foxholes. The 19-year-old from South Boston just did his job and counted the days until he could get back to his girl, Mary, and his mother's Irish stew. The perimeter check was routine, something they'd done hundreds of times before. Walk the outer edge of their temporary camp, look for signs of German stragglers or civilians who might cause problems, check the approaches that enemy forces might use for a surprise attack. It should have taken Jimmy maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours at most. The kid carried his rifle, his field pack with water and rations, and that little notebook he was always scribbling in when he thought nobody was looking. O'Brien walked to the edge of camp where he'd sent Jimmy earlier that afternoon. The ground was soft from recent spring rains, and he could see boot prints heading into the tree line. Jimmy's boots, size 8.5 with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel, where he favored that leg slightly after taking shrapnel in France. The tracks were clear for about 50 yards before they disappeared into the harder ground beyond the trees. Martinez, O'Brien called to Corporal Tony Martinez, who was cleaning his rifle near the supply tent. "When's the last time you saw Sullivan?" Martinez looked up, squinting in the fading light. "This afternoon, maybe 3:30. He was heading out for perimeter check. Said he'd be back before chow time." "Why, Sarge, where is he?" O'Brien felt the familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same feeling he'd gotten before every bad thing that had happened during their long campaign across Europe. "He's not back yet. Grab Williams and Jackson. We're going to take a look around before it gets too dark." They searched for an hour using flashlights, calling Jimmy's name and following every trail they could find. The Bavarian forest was thick with undergrowth and fallen logs, perfect cover for someone trying to hide or for concealing something you didn't want found. They found a few cigarette butts that might have been Jimmy's, lucky strikes like he always smoked, but nothing else. When they returned to camp empty-handed, O'Brien knew he had to make the call he'd been dreading. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison was not going to be happy about losing a soldier this close to the war's end, especially not one of the good ones like Sullivan. But regulations were clear. Any soldier missing for more than 4 hours without explanation had to be reported up the chain of command immediately. Morrison's reaction was exactly what O'Brien expected. "God damn it, Sergeant, we're less than a week from victory, and you're telling me one of your boys just vanished into thin air? Did he desert? Did he get himself killed by some fanatic with a Panzerfaust? What the hell happened out there?" "I don't know, sir," O'Brien replied honestly. "Sullivan's not the type to run off. Something happened to him, but I can't figure out what." Morrison rubbed his temples, looking older than his 42 years. The stress of command had worn on all of them, but losing men this late in the war felt like a personal failure. "All right, Sergeant. Get me every available man. We'll search through the night if we have to. No one gets left behind, not when we're this close to going home." The search continued for 3 days. They brought in tracker dogs from another unit, questioned every German civilian they could find, and expanded their search radius to include abandoned farms and bombed-out villages. They found the remnants of German positions, evidence of hastily abandoned campsites, and the scattered equipment of a retreating army. But they found no trace of Private First Class Jimmy Sullivan. By the 3rd day, even Morrison had to admit the obvious. Whatever had happened to Jimmy Sullivan, he wasn't coming back. Captain William Hayes arrived at the 42nd Infantry Division's temporary headquarters on May 3rd, 1945, carrying a leather briefcase filled with forms that nobody wanted to see. As the Army's Criminal Investigation Division representative for the European theater, Hayes specialized in cases that regular military police couldn't handle. Missing soldiers fell into that category, especially when they disappeared without explanation in the final days of what everyone hoped would be the last war America would ever have to fight. Hayes was a methodical man who had worked as a police detective in Chicago before the war. He understood that every missing person case started with 3 possibilities. The person left voluntarily, someone took them against their will, or they met with an accident. In military terms, that meant desertion, capture, or death by enemy action. His job was to figure out which one had happened to Private First Class James Sullivan. The first step was always the paperwork. Hayes spread Sullivan's military records across Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's desk and began building a picture of the missing soldier. What he found surprised him. Sullivan's service record was exemplary, the kind that made commanding officers write letters of recommendation and consider men for promotion. The kid had enlisted 3 days after his 18th birthday, completed basic training with honors, and shipped out to England with the 42nd Division in early 1944. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Sullivan had been wounded twice, both times refusing evacuation to rear hospitals when the medics said he could return to duty within a few days. He'd earned a Bronze Star for helping evacuate civilians during the liberation of a French village, and his marksmanship scores were consistently in the top 10% of his unit. This wasn't the profile of a soldier who would abandon his post and disappear into the German countryside. Hayes began interviewing Sullivan's squad mates one by one, starting with Sergeant O'Brien and working his way down through the enlisted men. Each interview painted the same picture of a quiet, reliable soldier who followed orders and looked out for his buddies. Nobody could think of a reason why Jimmy would want to desert, and several men mentioned that he'd been talking about getting home to Boston more frequently in recent weeks. Corporal Tony Martinez was particularly adamant about Sullivan's character. The two had become close friends during their time in combat, sharing foxholes and watching each other's backs through some of the worst fighting in Europe. Martinez sat across from Hayes in the makeshift interview room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Captain, I know Jimmy better than anybody in this unit," Martinez said, his voice steady but emotional. "That kid's been carrying around a picture of his girl Mary since we landed in France. Shows it to anybody who'll look. He was talking about going home to marry her, not running away from the army. Jimmy's got more guts than any 3 men I know. He wouldn't just disappear unless something bad happened to him." Hayes asked Martinez about Sullivan's behavior in the days before his disappearance. Had he seemed worried about anything? Had he mentioned problems with other soldiers or officers? Was there anything unusual about his mood or actions? Martinez thought carefully before answering. "Well, there was one thing. A couple days ago we were on patrol and found this hidden bunker, full of valuable stuff, looked like Nazi loot. Gold, paintings, jewelry. Jimmy was pretty upset about it. Said it probably belonged to people who got sent to those camps we've been hearing about. He wanted to make sure it got reported properly, that it didn't just disappear into somebody's pocket." This was the first Hayes had heard about any bunker or recovered Nazi treasure. He made careful notes and asked Martinez to show him exactly where this discovery had been made. The location was about 2 miles from where Sullivan had disappeared, close enough to be relevant but not necessarily connected. Hayes examined Sullivan's personal effects next. The contents of his footlocker revealed a young man focused on home and family. Letters from his mother and girlfriend, photographs of Boston Harbor, a worn copy of a detective novel, and a small wooden cross his mother had given him before shipping out. What was missing was more interesting than what was there. Sullivan's notebook, which several soldiers mentioned he carried everywhere, was nowhere to be found. After 3 days of interviews and evidence collection, Hayes had to conclude that Private First Class James Sullivan had not deserted. The young soldier's character, his plans for the future, and his behavior in the days before his disappearance all argued against voluntary absence. Something had happened to Jimmy Sullivan in the Bavarian countryside, something that left no trace and no witnesses. Whether that something was enemy action, criminal activity, or simple accident remained a mystery that Hayes couldn't solve with the available evidence. In his final report, Hayes recommended that Sullivan be classified as missing in action rather than absent without leave, a decision that would affect how his family was notified and whether they would receive his benefits. It was small comfort, but it was all the justice Hayes could provide for a good soldier who had simply vanished into the chaos of a war's end. The tenement building at 1247 Dorchester Avenue stood 4 stories tall and housed 3 generations of Irish families who had crossed the Atlantic looking for something better than what they'd left behind. The Sullivan family occupied a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, where the smell of boiled cabbage mixed with the salt air that drifted up from Boston Harbor 6 blocks away. Jimmy Sullivan had been born in that apartment on a cold February morning in 1926, the second son of Patrick and Margaret Sullivan. His father worked the docks at South Boston, loading and unloading cargo ships that brought goods from all over the world. It was hard work that left Patrick's hands permanently stained with tar and his back bent from years of lifting heavy loads, but it put food on the table and kept the rent paid. Margaret Sullivan took in washing from the wealthier families in Beacon Hill, scrubbing other people's clothes in the kitchen sink and hanging them to dry on lines strung between the tenement buildings. She was a small woman with fierce green eyes and hands that were never still, always working, always moving. Her greatest fear was that her boys would end up like their father, broken down by physical labor before they reached 40. Jimmy showed promise early. He was smart in school, good with numbers, and had a way of talking to people that made them listen. His teachers at Bridget's Catholic school suggested he might make a good accountant or maybe even a lawyer if the family could scrape together money for college. But dreams cost money that the Sullivans didn't have, and by the time Jimmy turned 16, he was working alongside his father on the docks, learning to read the manifests and helping coordinate the loading schedules. It was at the Harbor Light Dance Hall in September 1943 that Jimmy first laid eyes on Mary O'Connell. She was 17, with dark hair that caught the light when she moved and a laugh that could be heard over the music. Her father worked for the gas company, and her family lived in a slightly better neighborhood, but she didn't put on airs. When Jimmy finally worked up the courage to ask her to dance, she said yes, without hesitation. They spent the next year and a half building something together, long walks along the harbor on Sunday afternoons, visits to the library where Mary would help Jimmy improve his reading, and quiet conversations about the future they might have together when the war ended. Mary worked at Woolworth's during the day and took stenography classes at night, preparing for a career that would let her support herself if necessary. When the news about Pearl Harbor reached Boston, Jimmy knew his plans would have to change. He was 17, still too young to enlist, but he spent the next year watching older boys from the neighborhood march off to basic training. Some came home on leave wearing crisp uniforms and telling stories about exotic places. Others didn't come home at all, their names appearing on the memorial wall at St. Bridget's Church. On his 18th birthday, Jimmy walked into the Army recruiting station on Washington Street and signed his name to the papers that would change his life forever. Margaret Sullivan cried for 3 days, but she understood. This was what young men did when their country called. Mary promised to wait for him, writing letters every single day he was gone. Basic training at Fort Devens was harder than anything Jimmy had experienced on the docks. The physical demands pushed his body to its limits, but the mental challenges were what really tested him. Learning to use weapons, understanding military tactics, and most importantly, learning to trust the men around him with his life. Jimmy discovered he had a natural talent for leadership and an ability to stay calm under pressure that impressed his instructors. When the 42nd Infantry Division shipped out to England in early 1944, Jimmy carried 2 photographs in his breast pocket. One was of Mary, taken at a booth on Revere Beach, showing her smiling at the camera with the ocean behind her. The other was of his family, all squeezed together in front of their tenement building, his mother's arm around his shoulder and his younger brother Patrick grinning beside him. The landing at Normandy in June 1944 was Jimmy's baptism by fire. The chaos of combat, the noise of artillery and machine guns, the smell of cordite and death, all of it was worse than anything his imagination had prepared him for. But he survived D-Day and the fighting that followed, slowly learning the skills that would keep him alive through months of brutal warfare. Jimmy's letters home during those months spoke of liberation and justice. He wrote about freeing French villages from German occupation, about the gratitude of civilians who had suffered under Nazi rule, and about his growing understanding of what they were really fighting for. When his unit helped liberate concentration camps in the final weeks of the war, Jimmy's letters took on a different tone. "Ma," he wrote in March 1945, "I can't tell you everything I've seen, but I need you to know that we're doing something important here. We're making sure that the evil we've found can never happen again. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter what it costs." Those words would prove prophetic in ways that Jimmy Sullivan could never have imagined. By May 4th, 1945, the search for Private Jimmy Sullivan had become the largest missing soldier operation in the 42nd Infantry Division's recent history. What had started as a routine search for one missing GI had expanded into a 10-mile radius investigation that pulled resources from 3 different Army units and involved questioning every German civilian, prisoner, and official they could locate in the Bavarian countryside. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stood over a large map spread across a makeshift table in the command tent, red pins marking areas already searched, and blue pins indicating locations where witnesses claimed to have seen American soldiers in recent days. The pins created a scattered pattern across the rolling hills and dense forests southeast of Dachau, a reminder of just how much ground a single man could cover if he was determined to disappear. Captain Hayes had expanded his investigation beyond the simple question of whether Sullivan had deserted. The timing of the disappearance, coming just days after the 42nd Division had helped liberate Dachau concentration camp, raised new possibilities that made everyone uncomfortable. The horrors they had discovered at Dachau were still fresh in every soldier's mind, and the knowledge that some of the SS guards and camp officials had escaped before the Americans arrived added a dangerous element to the search. "Sir, we've made contact with the prisoner of war processing center at Nuremberg," Sergeant O'Brien reported to Morrison. "They've checked their intake records for the past week. No unidentified American soldiers have been brought in, and none of the German prisoners they've processed have mentioned capturing or seeing any Americans in the area where Sullivan disappeared." Morrison nodded grimly. If Jimmy had been captured by German forces, regular or irregular, he should have turned up in the POW system by now. The German army was in complete collapse, but they were still following military protocols when it came to prisoners of war. The fact that Sullivan hadn't appeared in any official capacity suggested something else had happened to him. The investigation had also expanded to include local hospitals and medical facilities. Dr. Klaus Weber, a German physician who had been treating wounded soldiers and civilians in the nearby village of Birching, was brought in for questioning. Weber spoke broken English but seemed genuinely willing to help. He insisted that no American soldiers had been brought to his makeshift clinic, and his records supported his claim. There have been many wounded men, Weber explained through an interpreter, but all German soldiers or civilians from the bombing, no Americans. I would remember because I would have been required to report them to your authorities. The most disturbing aspect of the expanded search was what they were learning about the final days before Dachau's liberation. Interviews with surviving prisoners revealed that several high-ranking SS officers had abandoned the camp in the days before American forces arrived, taking with them trucks loaded with documents and what prisoners described as valuables stolen from those who were murdered. Captain Hans Müller, an SS officer captured during the retreat from Dachau, provided information under interrogation that made Hayes reconsider Sullivan's disappearance entirely. Müller claimed that several of his fellow officers had established hiding places in the Bavarian countryside, waiting for the initial chaos of Germany's surrender to pass before attempting to escape to South America or other safe havens. They took everything they could carry, Müller told Hayes through an interpreter. Gold, jewelry, artwork, anything valuable that could be converted to cash later. Some of them are still out there, hiding in bunkers and caves, waiting for the right moment to run. This revelation put Sullivan's discovery of the hidden bunker in an entirely new light. If Jimmy had stumbled upon one of these SS hiding places, or if he had discovered evidence of war crimes and stolen treasure, he might have encountered desperate men with nothing left to lose. SS officers facing war crimes trials had every reason to eliminate witnesses, even American soldiers. Hayes expanded the search to include abandoned farms, hidden bunkers, and cave systems throughout the region. The 41 Division brought in engineering units with specialized equipment to search underground locations that might serve as hiding places for either fleeing Nazis or evidence of crimes. They found several concealed bunkers, most empty but some containing abandoned equipment and supplies that suggested recent occupation. The discovery that weighed most heavily on everyone's mind came on the 5th day of the expanded search. A patrol investigating a remote farmhouse found evidence that American soldiers had been in the area recently. Cigarette butts that matched the Lucky Strike brand Sullivan smoked, boot prints consistent with U.S. Army-issue footwear, and most disturbing of all, spots of what appeared to be dried blood on the wooden floor of an abandoned barn. The blood was carefully collected and sent for analysis, but the laboratory facilities available in post-war Germany were limited. It would be weeks before they could determine if the blood was human, let alone whether it might belong to Jimmy Sullivan. In the meantime, the search continued with a growing sense that they were looking for a body rather than a missing soldier. As the investigation entered its second week, Morrison had to face the reality that his division was needed for occupation duties and the transition to peacetime operations. The search for Jimmy Sullivan, while important, could not continue indefinitely with the resources of an entire infantry division. But the questions raised by his disappearance, particularly the connections to fleeing war criminals and hidden Nazi treasure, would continue to haunt everyone involved for decades to come. The Western Union delivery boy knocked on the door of 1247 Dorchester Avenue at 2:30 in the afternoon on May 6, 1945. Mary O'Connell happened to be visiting the Sullivan family that day, helping Margaret with the weekly washing and talking about the letters they'd both received from Jimmy just a week earlier. The boy couldn't have been more than 14, wearing a uniform that was too big for his thin frame and carrying a leather pouch filled with the yellow envelopes that everyone in America had learned to fear. Margaret Sullivan dried her hands on her apron before opening the door, her heart already sinking at the sight of the telegram in the boy's outstretched hand. She had seen too many neighbors receive these messages over the past 3 years, had watched too many mothers collapse in doorways and too many families begin the terrible waiting that came with uncertain news from overseas. The telegram was brief and official, written in the cold language that the War Department used to deliver the worst possible news to families across the country. Regret to inform you that your son, Private First Class James Sullivan, has been reported missing in action in Germany since 30 April 1945. Letter follows. The Adjutant General. Mary O'Connell read the telegram over Margaret's shoulder and felt her knees go weak. Missing in action could mean anything. It could mean Jimmy was wounded and lying in some German hospital unable to identify himself. It could mean he was captured and being held in a prisoner of war camp that hadn't been liberated yet. Or it could mean something much worse that the telegram didn't say directly. Margaret Sullivan's reaction surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of crying or fainting like she had seen other mothers do, she folded the telegram carefully and placed it on the kitchen table next to Jimmy's last letter home. Then she turned to Mary and her younger son Patrick, who had come running from his bedroom when he heard the commotion. "Missing doesn't mean dead," she said firmly, her Irish accent thickening the way it always did when she was emotional. "It means they don't know where he is, and we're going to help them find him. Patrick, get me that box of writing paper from the closet. Mary, you sit down and help me think of everyone we need to write to." Patrick Sullivan was 16 years old and had been counting the days until his 18th birthday when he could enlist and follow his older brother into the army. The news about Jimmy being missing made that waiting feel impossible. While his mother began composing letters to senators and army officials, Patrick announced his intention to lie about his age and enlist immediately. "I'm going over there to find him," Patrick declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "Jimmy wouldn't leave me behind if I was missing. I won't leave him behind either." Margaret turned from her letter writing and fixed her younger son with the stern look that had kept both boys in line throughout their childhood. "You'll do no such thing, Patrick Sullivan. Your brother is missing, not dead, and when he comes home, he's going to expect to find his family here waiting for him. You're needed here to help me write letters and make phone calls and do whatever else it takes to find out what happened to him." The letter-writing campaign that Margaret Sullivan launched from her kitchen table would continue for the next 20 years. She wrote to senators and congressmen, to the War Department, and later the Department of Defense, to the Red Cross and veterans organizations. She contacted newspaper reporters and anyone else who might be willing to listen to a mother's plea for information about her missing son. Father McKenna at St. Patrick's Cathedral organized prayer vigils for Jimmy's safe return. Every Tuesday evening, Margaret and Mary would join a small group of parishioners in the candlelit church, praying the rosary and asking God to watch over Jimmy wherever he might be. The vigils continued even as the war in Europe ended and American soldiers began coming home in massive numbers. Mary O'Connell kept her promise to wait for Jimmy, turning down dates with other young men and keeping his picture on her dresser next to the engagement ring he had given her before shipping out. She found work as a secretary at an insurance company and saved money for the wedding they had planned for after the war. But as weeks turned into months without news, she began to understand that the future she had dreamed about might never happen. The promised letter from the Adjutant General arrived 3 weeks after the telegram, containing more official language but no additional information. The Army regretted to inform the family that despite extensive searches, no trace of Private Sullivan had been found. His personal effects would be forwarded to the family, and they would be notified immediately if any new information became available. Margaret Sullivan read the letter twice, then placed it in the wooden box where she was collecting all correspondence related to Jimmy's disappearance. The box would eventually hold hundreds of letters, official reports, and newspaper clippings. It would become the center of a campaign that would define the rest of her life. A mother's refusal to accept that her son had simply vanished without explanation into the chaos of a war's end. Patrick Sullivan never did enlist in the Army, choosing instead to honor his mother's wishes and stay home to help with the search. But the guilt of not following his brother into combat would stay with him for the rest of his life, driving him to succeed in school and eventually law school, always with the goal of having the skills and connections necessary to find out what had really happened to Jimmy in those Bavarian woods in the spring of 1945. Victory in Europe Day came on May 8, 1945, with church bells ringing across Boston and crowds celebrating in the streets. At 1247 Dorchester Avenue, the Sullivan family listened to President Truman's radio address from their small kitchen, but there was no celebration in their home. While the rest of America rejoiced that the war in Europe was finally over, Margaret Sullivan sat at her kitchen table, writing another letter to the War Department, asking for any new information about her missing son. The official end of hostilities in Germany should have meant answers for families like the Sullivans. With the fighting stopped and the chaos of combat replaced by organized occupation, the Army should have been able to account for every missing soldier. Prisoners of war were being processed and returned to Allied control. Bodies were being recovered from battlefields and identified. The massive bureaucracy of the American military was finally able to turn its attention to the thousands of administrative loose ends that war had created. But Jimmy Sullivan remained a mystery that no amount of paperwork could solve. Captain Hayes had completed his investigation by mid-May, filing a comprehensive report that documented everything the Army had learned about the missing private. The report was thorough and professional, containing witness statements, search records, and a detailed timeline of Sullivan's last known activities. What it didn't contain was any concrete evidence of what had happened to him. The conclusion was both inevitable and unsatisfying. Based on the available evidence, the report stated, Private First Class James Sullivan had most likely died as a result of enemy action on or about April 30th, 1945. The absence of a body was explained by the chaotic conditions of the war's final days and the possibility that German forces had concealed evidence of their crimes. The report recommended that Sullivan be classified as missing in action, presumed dead, a determination that would affect everything from how his family was notified to what benefits they would receive. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison signed the report with a heavy heart. He had commanded men through some of the worst fighting in Europe, had written too many letters to families who would never see their sons again. But there was something particularly troubling about Sullivan's case, a sense that important questions remained unanswered. The young soldier's exemplary record, the circumstances of his disappearance, and the complete absence of any trace all suggested that this was more than a simple combat death. The package containing Jimmy's personal effects arrived at the Sullivan home on a rainy Tuesday morning in late May. Margaret Sullivan signed for it with shaking hands, then carried the olive-drab canvas bag to her bedroom before opening it. Inside were the belongings that had defined her son's life as a soldier, his extra uniform, carefully folded and still smelling faintly of the harsh soap they used to wash clothes in the field. His mess kit, dented from months of use but scrubbed clean. The wooden rosary beads she had given him before he left for basic training, worn smooth from handling. There were also items she hadn't expected to see again. The photograph of the family taken in front of their tenement building, now creased and faded from being carried in Jimmy's breast pocket. A small leather journal where he had recorded addresses of people he'd met in Europe, planning to write to them after the war. Letters from home that he had saved, including several from Mary O'Connell that made Margaret's heart ache to read. What wasn't in the package troubled Margaret more than what was. Jimmy's notebook, the small composition book where he recorded his thoughts and observations, was nowhere to be found. Every soldier who had known her son mentioned that notebook, how Jimmy was always writing in it during quiet moments. Sergeant O'Brien had specifically mentioned seeing Jimmy with it just days before his disappearance. Its absence felt significant, though Margaret couldn't explain why. 2 weeks after the personal effects arrived, a second package was delivered to the Sullivan home. This one contained Jimmy's medals, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, the Bronze Star for valor, and several campaign ribbons documenting his service from D-Day through the final assault on Germany. The medals came with official citations describing Jimmy's courage and dedication, but they felt cold and inadequate compared to the questions that remained unanswered. The final official communication came in July 1945, a letter from the Adjutant General's office informing the family that Private Sullivan's case was being closed. The letter expressed the Army's sympathy for their loss and assured them that everything possible had been done to locate their son. If new information became available, the family would be notified immediately. Until then, Jimmy Sullivan would be carried on the Army's rolls as missing in action, presumed dead. Margaret Sullivan read the letter twice, then placed it in the wooden box that was becoming her archive of the search for Jimmy. The box contained dozens of letters she had written and received, copies of official reports, and newspaper clippings about missing soldiers. It was growing larger every month as Margaret expanded her campaign to find answers about her son. The hardest part was the uncertainty. If Jimmy was dead, where was his body? If he had been captured, why hadn't he appeared in prisoner of war records? If he had been killed by retreating German forces, why was there no evidence of the crime? The questions multiplied rather than resolved as time passed, creating a weight of doubt that settled over the Sullivan family like fog rolling in from Boston Harbor. Mary O'Connell continued to visit the Sullivan home regularly, helping Margaret with correspondence and keeping vigil for news that never came. She had received several marriage proposals from other young men, but couldn't bring herself to accept any of them. Somewhere in her heart, she still believed that Jimmy would come walking up Dorchester Avenue with that shy smile and those bright blue eyes, ready to pick up the life they had planned together. But as summer turned to fall and the first anniversary of Jimmy's disappearance approached, even the most optimistic members of the Sullivan family had to face the probability that they would never see him again. The wooden box in Margaret Sullivan's bedroom grew heavier with each passing year, filled with hundreds of letters, carbon copies of her own correspondence, and official responses that all said essentially the same thing. The United States Army had no additional information about the fate of Private First Class James Sullivan. But Margaret's determination never wavered, even as the responses became more form letters and less personal attention from government officials. By 1950, Margaret had established a routine that would define the next 2 decades of her life. Every Monday morning, she would sit at her kitchen table with her fountain pen and carefully composed stationery, writing letters to anyone who might have access to new information about missing soldiers. She contacted senators and congressmen, military officials, and veterans organizations, foreign governments, and international relief agencies. Her letters were always polite but persistent, explaining Jimmy's case and asking for help in finding answers. The Red Cross became one of Margaret's most frequent contacts. The organization had established programs to help families locate missing relatives in the aftermath of World War II, and Margaret wrote to them quarterly with updates about her search and requests for assistance. The Red Cross workers were sympathetic and professional, but they had limited resources and thousands of similar cases. Jimmy Sullivan's disappearance was just one file among many in their extensive records of unsolved cases. When the War Department was reorganized into the Department of Defense in 1947, Margaret had to learn an entirely new bureaucracy and establish relationships with different officials. She approached this challenge with the same methodical determination that had characterized her search from the beginning. She made lists of new contacts, researched chain-of-command structures, and adapted her letters to address the specific responsibilities of different offices and departments. Patrick Sullivan had graduated from law school in 1953 and established a small practice in downtown Boston, specializing in veterans affairs and immigration cases. He used his legal training to help his mother navigate the increasingly complex federal bureaucracy, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and using his professional contacts to open doors that might otherwise remain closed. But even with legal expertise and persistent effort, the family found themselves running into the same dead ends that had frustrated their search for years. The most promising lead came in 1962, when Margaret received a letter from a German historian named Klaus Weber, who was researching American military operations in Bavaria during the final months of the war. Weber had heard about Jimmy's case through veterans organizations and offered to assist with research in German archives and local records. His letter sparked hope that someone with access to German sources might uncover information that American investigators had missed. This correspondence led to Margaret's decision to travel to Germany herself in the summer of 1965, 20 years after Jimmy's disappearance. At 68 years old, she had never traveled outside of Massachusetts, but she was determined to walk the ground where her son had last been seen and talk to anyone who might remember something from those chaotic final days of the war. The trip was expensive, requiring Margaret to dip into savings she had been carefully accumulating for decades. Patrick offered to pay for the journey, but Margaret insisted on financing it herself. This was her mission, her responsibility as Jimmy's mother, and she would not burden her surviving son with the cost of her grief. Weber met Margaret at the Munich airport and served as her guide and translator during her week in Bavaria. They visited the area where Jimmy's unit had been stationed, walked the roads where he had conducted his final patrol, and spoke with local residents who remembered the American Liberation Forces. The countryside was beautiful and peaceful, showing no signs of the violence that had swept through the region 20 years earlier. The conversations with local villagers were both encouraging and frustrating. Many older residents remembered the American soldiers fondly, recalling their relief at being liberated from Nazi rule and their gratitude for the food and medical supplies the Americans had provided. Several people specifically remembered soldiers from the 42nd Infantry Division, describing them as well-disciplined and respectful toward German civilians. But when Margaret showed them Jimmy's photograph and described his disappearance, the villagers could offer no useful information. A few thought they might have seen him among the American soldiers, but their memories were vague and unreliable after so many years. No one remembered a missing American soldier or any unusual incidents involving German civilians and American military personnel. Margaret visited the site where Jimmy's unit had discovered the hidden bunker filled with Nazi treasure, though the exact location had become overgrown and difficult to identify. She stood in the Bavarian forest, trying to imagine what her son might have experienced in his final days, what he might have seen or learned that could have led to his disappearance. The peaceful silence of the woods offered no answers to her questions. The trip's most emotional moment came when Margaret visited the American military cemetery at Munich, where hundreds of soldiers who had died in the final campaigns of the war were buried. She walked among the white crosses and stars of David, reading names and wondering whether Jimmy should have been among them. At least these families knew where their sons were buried, could visit their graves and leave flowers. Margaret envied them their certainty, even though it came with the finality of death. Margaret returned to Boston empty-handed but not discouraged. The trip had given her a better understanding of the area where Jimmy had disappeared and had connected her with German researchers who promised to continue looking for information in local archives. More importantly, it had reinforced her belief that answers existed somewhere, waiting to be discovered by someone persistent enough to keep looking. Back in her Dorchester apartment, Margaret resumed her letter-writing campaign with renewed energy. The wooden box in her bedroom continued to grow, filled with correspondence from around the world as her search expanded to include international organizations and foreign governments. She had become something of a legend among families of missing servicemen, a symbol of maternal determination that inspired others to continue their own searches for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. The law office of Sullivan, M.N. Associates occupied the entire third floor of a brownstone building on State Street, just 3 blocks from Boston Harbor, where Patrick Sullivan's father had once loaded cargo ships for 12 hours a day. By 1975, Patrick had built a successful practice specializing in veterans affairs and personal injury cases, but the most important case of his career remained unsolved in filing cabinets that lined one wall of his private office. Margaret Sullivan had passed away the previous winter, dying peacefully in her sleep at Massachusetts General Hospital with Patrick holding her hand. Her final words had been about Jimmy, asking her surviving son to promise that he would continue the search she had pursued for 30 years. Patrick had made that promise, and now the responsibility for finding answers about his brother's disappearance rested entirely on his shoulders. The transfer of materials from his mother's apartment to his law office had required 2 full days and a rental truck. 30 years of correspondence had filled dozens of boxes, creating an archive that documented not just Jimmy's case but the broader struggle of families seeking information about missing servicemen. Patrick spent weeks organizing the materials chronologically, creating an index system that would allow him to cross-reference information and identify patterns that might have been missed over the years. What he discovered during this organizational process both impressed and frustrated him. His mother had been remarkably thorough in her research, maintaining detailed records of every contact she had made and every response she had received. But Patrick's legal training allowed him to see gaps and inconsistencies that his mother, despite her determination, had lacked the expertise to identify. The most significant discrepancy involved the timeline of Jimmy's disappearance. According to the official Army report, Private Sullivan had been reported missing on April 30th, 1945, during a routine patrol near Dachau. But Patrick found letters from Jimmy's squad mates that suggested a different sequence of events. Corporal Tony Martinez had written to the family in 1946, mentioning that Jimmy had discovered the hidden bunker 2 days before his disappearance, not on the same day as the official report indicated. This seemingly minor discrepancy raised larger questions about the accuracy of the Army's investigation. If they had gotten basic facts wrong about the timeline, what other errors might have been made in the original case file? Patrick began reaching out to surviving members of Jimmy's unit, tracking down men who were now in their 50s and scattered across the country. The interviews Patrick conducted revealed a pattern of information that had never been properly investigated. Several veterans mentioned that Jimmy had been excited about something he had discovered in the days before his disappearance, something he felt was important enough to report to higher command. But none of them had been questioned about this during the original investigation, and their knowledge had never made it into the official record. More disturbing were the hints of conflict between Jimmy and some of his officers. Private Robert Chen, who had served in the same company, told Patrick during a telephone interview that Jimmy had been asking uncomfortable questions about what would happen to the treasure they had discovered. Chen remembered Jimmy being upset about the possibility that valuable items might disappear into private hands rather than being returned to their rightful owners. "Your brother was always talking about doing the right thing," Chen told Patrick. "He said the stuff in that bunker belonged to people who had been murdered by the Nazis, and he wasn't going to let anybody steal from the dead. Some of the brass didn't appreciate that kind of talk." Patrick's legal instincts told him that these revelations warranted a formal reopening of his brother's case. He began preparing a comprehensive brief that documented all the discrepancies and new information he had uncovered, planning to submit it to the Department of Defense with a formal request for a new investigation. The brief took months to prepare, requiring Patrick to master military regulations and bureaucratic procedures that were far removed from his usual legal practice. The process of investigating his brother's disappearance also revealed how much Patrick's own life had been shaped by Jimmy's absence. He had served in Korea partly to honor his missing brother's military service, had chosen law school partly to gain the skills necessary to fight bureaucracy, and had specialized in veterans affairs partly to help other families navigate the same systems that had frustrated his mother for decades. Patrick's wife, Ellen, understood the importance of this work to her husband, but she worried about the emotional toll it was taking. Patrick often worked late into the night, surrounded by photographs and letters from a brother he barely remembered but felt responsible for finding. The search for Jimmy had become both a legal case and a personal mission, a way of honoring both his missing brother and his deceased mother's determination. The breakthrough Patrick had been hoping for came in an unexpected form. While reviewing his mother's correspondence, he he found a letter from a former Army clerk named Harold Fisher, who had worked in the records department of the 42nd Infantry Division in 1945. Fisher had written to Margaret in 1967, mentioning that he remembered seeing unusual paperwork related to Jimmy's case, documents that had been classified and removed from the standard files. Patrick tracked down Fisher, now retired and living in Florida, and convinced him to share what he remembered about those classified documents. Fisher's memory was hazy after 30 years, but he distinctly recalled seeing reports that mentioned valuable property and potential security concerns related to Jimmy's disappearance. The documents had been marked with classification stamps that Fisher had never seen before, suggesting they involved intelligence agencies rather than standard military police. This revelation opened an entirely new avenue of investigation that Patrick's mother had never been able to pursue. If intelligence agencies had been involved in Jimmy's case, it suggested that his disappearance was more than a simple missing soldier investigation. It hinted at connections to war crimes, stolen Nazi treasure, and possibly even cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of the American military command. Patrick realized that solving his brother's case would require resources and expertise that went far beyond what a single attorney could provide. But for the first time in 30 years, the Sullivan family had concrete evidence that there was more to Jimmy's story than they had ever been told. The Freedom of Information Act had been law for nearly 15 years by 1981, but Patrick Sullivan was just beginning to understand how powerful it could be as a tool for uncovering government secrets. The passage of the act in 1966 had opened doors that had been sealed shut for decades, allowing families like his to request documents that had previously been buried in classified files. Patrick's legal training helped him craft requests that were specific enough to avoid rejection, but broad enough to capture relevant information. His first FOIA request to the Department of Defense was deliberately comprehensive, asking for all documents related to Private First Class James Sullivan and the 42nd Infantry Division's activities in Bavaria during April and May 1945. The response took 8 months to arrive, and when it did, Patrick was both encouraged and frustrated by what he received. The government had located over 300 pages of relevant documents, but many were so heavily redacted with black ink that they were almost impossible to read. What remained visible, however, painted a picture of military operations that went far beyond the simple combat and occupation duties that Patrick had always assumed characterized his brother's final weeks. The 42nd Infantry Division had been tasked with securing Nazi documentation, interrogating captured war criminals, and cataloging stolen art and treasure that was being recovered throughout Bavaria. Jimmy's unit hadn't just been fighting German soldiers, they had been involved in one of the largest criminal investigations in history. One document that caught Patrick's attention was a memo dated May 20, 1945, just 2 days after Jimmy's disappearance. The memo, sent from the 42nd Division's intelligence officer to higher command, mentioned complications arising from the discovery of significant assets and the need for enhanced security measures regarding personnel with knowledge of sensitive materials. Most of the specifics were redacted, but the timing suggested a connection to Jimmy's case. Another partially declassified report revealed that the 42nd Division had been working closely with agents from the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. These intelligence operatives were conducting their own investigation into Nazi treasure and war crimes, operating with authority that superseded normal military command structures. The report mentioned several instances where OSS agents had requested that certain information be classified and removed from standard military records. Patrick's breakthrough came when he discovered a reference to something called Operation Bernhard Recovery buried in a footnote of a logistics report. The footnote mentioned that several soldiers from the 42nd Division had been reassigned to special duties related to this operation, but their names and specific roles were completely redacted. Patrick had never heard of Operation Bernhard, but his research revealed it to be a Nazi counterfeiting operation that had produced millions of dollars in fake British pounds and American dollars. The connection between counterfeiting and Jimmy's discovery of the hidden bunker began to make sense when Patrick found references to currency and documentation recovery in several of the declassified files. The Nazis hadn't just stolen art and jewelry from their victims. They had also been involved in sophisticated financial crimes that threatened the stability of Allied currencies. If Jimmy had discovered evidence of these operations, it would have been considered a matter of national security. Most frustrating were the documents that remained completely classified, referenced in indexes but unavailable even under FOIA requests. These files were marked with classification levels that Patrick's research indicated were reserved for intelligence operations with ongoing security implications. The fact that documents related to his brother's case remained classified 40 years after the war suggested that whatever Jimmy had discovered was still considered sensitive by the American government. Patrick's legal contacts helped him understand that the heavy redactions and continued classification were not necessarily signs of a conspiracy, but they did indicate that Jimmy's case had involved more than a simple missing soldier investigation. The government's response to his FOIA requests was professional and thorough, but it was clear that significant information was being withheld for reasons that went beyond protecting individual privacy. The most revealing document Patrick received was a partially declassified report from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, dated June 1945. The report mentioned that Private Sullivan's case had been transferred to appropriate intelligence authorities and that further investigation would be conducted outside normal military channels. This transfer explained why Patrick's mother had received so little information over the years. The case had been moved away from the military bureaucracy that she had been contacting for decades. Armed with this new information, Patrick began crafting a different strategy for his investigation. Instead of focusing solely on military records, he started researching the intelligence agencies that had been active in post-war Germany. He contacted historians who specialized in OSS operations and began building relationships with former intelligence officers who might be willing to share information about activities that had occurred 40 years earlier. The declassified documents had answered some questions about Jimmy's disappearance, while raising many others. Patrick now knew that his brother had become involved in intelligence operations related to Nazi war crimes and financial conspiracies, operations important enough that information about them remained classified decades later. But he still didn't know what had happened to Jimmy, or whether the official explanation of his death was accurate. What Patrick did know was that his family deserved better answers than they had received, and that the truth about Jimmy's fate was hidden somewhere in files that the government was still reluctant to release. The search for his missing brother had evolved from a family's quest for closure into an investigation that touched on some of the most sensitive operations of World War II. Klaus Weber's letter arrived at Patrick Sullivan's law office on a rainy Tuesday morning in March 1984, written on letterhead from the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. The German historian had been researching American liberation forces in Bavaria for his doctoral dissertation and had come across references to Jimmy Sullivan's case in archived military records. Weber's English was formal but clear, and his offer to share information caught Patrick's attention immediately. "Mr. Sullivan," Weber had written, "I have been studying the final weeks of the war in my region and have uncovered several incidents involving American soldiers and fleeing Nazi officials that were never properly documented. Your brother's disappearance occurred during a period of significant activity by SS officers attempting to escape prosecution. I believe our research might be mutually beneficial." Patrick's response was immediate. He had been frustrated by the limitations of researching from Boston, relying on translated documents and secondhand sources for information about what had happened in Bavaria 40 years earlier. The opportunity to work with a German historian who had access to local archives and could interview surviving witnesses was exactly what his investigation needed. Their first exchange of letters revealed that Weber had uncovered a troubling pattern of events in the weeks surrounding Jimmy's disappearance. According to German police records that had been sealed for decades, at least 6 high-ranking SS officers had vanished from the Munich area between April 25 and May 10, 1945. These weren't ordinary soldiers retreating from advancing Allied forces. They were war criminals with detailed knowledge of Nazi treasure hoards and escape networks. Weber's research had identified 3 specific SS officers, whose disappearances coincided almost exactly with Jimmy Sullivan's vanishing. SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Müller had been responsible for managing stolen art and currency at Dachau concentration camp. SS Sturmbannführer Karl Brenner had overseen the movement of Nazi gold reserves from Berlin to hidden locations in Bavaria. SS Untersturmführer Franz Weber, no relation to the historian, had been involved in coordinating escape routes for Nazi officials fleeing to South America. The most intriguing connection came through Weber's interviews with elderly residents of the villages near where Jimmy had disappeared. Several people remembered seeing unusual activity in the forests during late April 1945, including the movement of vehicles at night and the sound of digging or construction work. One farmer specifically recalled encountering a group of men in civilian clothes who spoke German with Berlin accents, unusual for rural Bavaria where the local dialect was distinctly different. Weber had also discovered records indicating that substantial amounts of Nazi treasure had been moved through the area in the weeks before Germany's surrender. Train manifests showed shipments of cultural artifacts and financial documents being transported from Munich to smaller stations throughout the region. These shipments had stopped abruptly on April 28th, just 2 days before Jimmy's disappearance, suggesting that the transportation network had been disrupted by approaching Allied forces. The German historian's most significant finding was evidence that several SS officers had established elaborate hiding places in the Bavarian countryside, complete with supplies, forged documents, and communication equipment. These weren't simple foxholes or temporary shelters. They were sophisticated facilities designed to hide war criminals for months or even years, while they waited for opportunities to escape to friendlier countries. Patrick's legal analysis of Weber's research revealed a pattern that was both logical and disturbing. If Jimmy had discovered one of these hiding places, or if he had encountered SS officers attempting to transport stolen treasure, he would have posed a significant threat to their escape plans. A young American soldier with knowledge of war crimes and hidden assets would have been seen as a witness who needed to be eliminated. Weber's investigation had also uncovered evidence that some American personnel had been corrupted by the vast wealth they encountered in occupied Germany. There were documented cases of Allied soldiers and officers stealing Nazi treasure for personal gain, often in partnership with German officials who offered bribes in exchange for safe passage. The temptation was enormous, and the oversight was minimal in the chaotic final weeks of the war. The correspondence between Patrick and Weber revealed that Jimmy's disappearance fit into a larger pattern of incidents that had been deliberately concealed by both German and American authorities. The German government had been reluctant to document the escape of war criminals, fearing that such information would complicate post-war reconstruction efforts. The American military had classified information about missing soldiers when their cases involved sensitive intelligence operations or potential embarrassment to Allied command. Weber's research suggested that Jimmy Sullivan had become entangled in a web of war crimes, stolen treasure, and escape networks that involved both Nazi officials and potentially corrupted American personnel. His disappearance wasn't a simple case of a soldier being killed in combat. It was the elimination of a witness who had discovered evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The collaboration between Patrick and Weber created a foundation for understanding Jimmy's fate that went far beyond anything the official Army investigation had uncovered. But it also raised new questions about how high the corruption had reached and whether American authorities had been complicit in covering up Jimmy's murder. The truth about what had happened to Private First Class James Sullivan was becoming more complex and more disturbing with each new piece of evidence they uncovered. Patrick realized that solving his brother's case would require more than just historical research. It would require confronting the possibility that Jimmy had been betrayed by his own command, and that the cover-up had been orchestrated at the highest levels of the American military. The computer screen in Michael Sullivan's home office displayed dozens of browser tabs, each one representing a different angle of investigation into his grandfather's disappearance. It was 2003, and the internet had transformed how families could research missing relatives from World War II. What had taken his grandmother, Margaret, decades to accomplish, through handwritten letters and phone calls, Michael could now do in hours, using search engines, digital archives, and online databases. Michael was 32 years old, a software engineer who worked for a technology company in Cambridge, just across the river from Boston. He had grown up hearing stories about Uncle Jimmy, the mysterious family member who had vanished in Germany before Michael's father Patrick was old enough to really remember him. The search for Jimmy had defined both his grandmother's and father's lives, but Michael brought a different set of skills to the investigation. The first step had been digitizing everything. Michael spent months scanning thousands of documents from the boxes his father had inherited from Margaret Sullivan. Letters, military records, photographs, and newspaper clippings were all converted to digital files and organized in a database that allowed for sophisticated searching and cross-referencing. What had once required hours of manually sorting through papers could now be accomplished with simple keyword searches. The digitization process revealed patterns that had been impossible to see when the information existed only on paper. Michael created timeline visualizations that showed the relationships between different events, mapping software that displayed the geographic locations relevant to Jimmy's case, and network diagrams that illustrated connections between various people mentioned in the documents. For the first time, the Sullivan family's 60 years of research could be analyzed as a comprehensive data set. Michael's breakthrough came when he discovered online communities of families searching for missing World War II servicemen. The Department of Defense had established official databases of unaccounted-for personnel, but families had created their own networks for sharing information and coordinating research. These informal groups had uncovered connections and patterns that official investigations had missed, often because they were comparing cases across different units and time periods. Through a website called missingservicemen.org, Michael connected with other families whose relatives had disappeared in Bavaria during the same time period as Jimmy. The stories were remarkably similar. Soldiers who had been involved in securing Nazi assets, who had discovered evidence of war crimes, or who had asked uncomfortable questions about what would happen to recovered treasure, all had vanished without a trace in the final weeks of the war. The most significant connection came through contact with the family of Sergeant Robert Morrison, no relation to Jimmy's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Sergeant Morrison had been with the 45th Infantry Division and had disappeared on May 3, 1945, just 3 days after Jimmy vanished. His family had been searching for answers for 58 years and had accumulated their own archive of documents and correspondence. When Michael compared the details of the two cases, the similarities were striking. Both soldiers had discovered hidden Nazi treasure in the same geographic area. Both had expressed concerns about ensuring that recovered assets were handled properly rather than being stolen by American personnel. Both had disappeared while conducting routine patrols in areas that should have been completely secure. And both cases had been transferred to intelligence agencies and classified in ways that prevented families from obtaining complete information. Michael's database searches revealed 3 additional cases that fit the same pattern. Corporal James Chen from the 3rd Infantry Division, Private William O'Connor from the 42nd Infantry Division, and Technical Sergeant David Martinez from an attached engineer unit. All had disappeared between April 28 and May 8, 1945, all in the same region of Bavaria, and all after discovering evidence related to Nazi war crimes or stolen treasure. The pattern suggested something that the original investigators had either missed or deliberately ignored. Jimmy Sullivan's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic elimination of American soldiers who had become inconvenient witnesses to criminal activity involving stolen Nazi assets. The fact that 5 different soldiers from different units had vanished under similar circumstances indicated a coordinated effort rather than random violence or combat casualties. Michael's technological approach also revealed gaps in the official records that previous investigators hadn't been able to identify. By cross-referencing unit rosters, battle reports, and personnel records, he discovered that several key documents were missing from the archives. The absence of these records wasn't random. They were specifically the documents that would have contained detailed information about the discovered treasure and the soldiers who had been involved in securing it. The online research also connected Michael with academic historians who were studying post-war treasure recovery operations. These scholars had access to recently declassified documents and were beginning to piece together the full scope of Nazi looting and Allied recovery efforts. Their research suggested that the amount of stolen treasure discovered in Bavaria was far larger than had been publicly acknowledged, and that significant quantities had never been accounted for in official records. Michael's digital investigation had transformed the Sullivan family's understanding of Jimmy's fate. What had seemed like an isolated tragedy was actually part of a much larger pattern of crime and cover-up. The technology that allowed Michael to analyze decades of research and connect with families around the world had revealed evidence that would have been impossible to discover using traditional investigative methods. But the new information also raised disturbing questions about how high the conspiracy had reached and whether justice was still possible 60 years after the crimes had been committed. Michael realized that solving his grandfather's case would require more than just digital research. It would require physical evidence that could prove what the patterns in the data suggested had happened to Jimmy Sullivan and the other missing soldiers. The Bavarian countryside looked peaceful and innocent in the early morning light of September 15, 2005, showing no signs of the violence that had swept through the region 60 years earlier. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of what had once been a battlefield, watching her graduate students unload ground-penetrating radar equipment from the back of a rented van. The archaeological survey they were about to conduct was unlike anything Boston University had ever attempted, a search for evidence of crimes that had been deliberately concealed for 6 decades. Patrick Sullivan, now 76 years old, had funded the expedition with his own money and contributions from 4 other families whose relatives had disappeared in the same area during the final weeks of World War II. The project had taken 2 years to organize, requiring permissions from German authorities, coordination with local historians, and the assembly of a team with expertise in both archaeology and military history. Dr. Chen was an expert in conflict archaeology, a relatively new field that used scientific methods to investigate sites of historical violence. She had worked on projects related to the American Civil War and more recent conflicts in the Balkans, but the Sullivan case presented unique challenges. They were looking for evidence of events that had been classified by intelligence agencies and deliberately obscured by both German and American authorities. The survey area covered nearly 10 square miles of rolling hills and dense forest, based on the best estimates of where Jimmy Sullivan and the other missing soldiers had been conducting their final patrols. Klaus Weber, now a professor at the University of Munich, had spent months researching historical maps and interviewing elderly residents to identify the most promising locations for investigation. Michael Sullivan had traveled from Boston to observe the survey, bringing laptop computers loaded with databases and analysis software that would help correlate any discoveries with the digital archives he had compiled. The combination of traditional archaeological methods and modern technology represented the most comprehensive investigation ever conducted into his grandfather's disappearance. The ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies immediately. The first scan, conducted in a forested area about 2 miles from where Jimmy's unit had been stationed, showed clear evidence of human activity that didn't match the natural geological patterns. Dr. Chen pointed to the green lines moving across her equipment's screen, indicating buried metal objects and disturbed soil that suggested deliberate excavation. "We're definitely looking at artificial disturbance," Dr. Chen explained to Patrick and Michael Sullivan as they watched the radar operation. "Something was buried here, and it was buried deep enough to require significant effort. The metal signatures suggest military equipment, possibly vehicles or large containers." The second anomaly was even more intriguing. Located in a small clearing that had been used as a staging area by American forces in 1945, the radar detected what appeared to be a rectangular chamber about 8 feet underground. The dimensions were consistent with a bunker or storage facility, and the depth suggested it had been deliberately concealed rather than simply abandoned. Dr. Chen's team marked each anomaly with GPS coordinates and began the careful process of planning excavations. Archaeological work required patience and precision, especially when the sites might contain human remains or evidence of war crimes. Every layer of soil had to be photographed and documented before removal, and any artifacts had to be preserved for potential use as legal evidence. The local German authorities had assigned an observer to the project, Detective Inspector Hans Müller from the Bavarian State Criminal Police. Müller's grandfather had been a police officer in the area during the 1940s and had left behind notes about unusual incidents involving American soldiers and missing persons. The cooperation between the American researchers and German authorities represented a significant change from the secrecy that had characterized the original investigations. Klaus Weber served as liaison with local residents, many of whom were surprisingly supportive of the archaeological survey. The older generation remembered the chaos of the war's end and the persistent rumors about hidden treasure and missing people. Several villagers offered their own stories about strange activities they had witnessed as children, including nighttime digging operations and the disappearance of local residents who had asked too many questions. The most promising lead came from Heinrich Zimmermann, an 83-year-old farmer who had been 12 years old when the Americans liberated his village. Zimmermann remembered seeing American soldiers working with German civilians in the forest, using military equipment to dig large holes. The activity had continued for several days before stopping abruptly, and the area had been declared off-limits to local residents. "They worked mostly at night," Zimmermann told Dr. Chen through Klaus Weber's translation. "We could hear the engines and see lights in the forest. My father said they were burying something important, something the Americans didn't want anyone else to find." The ground-penetrating radar survey took 5 days to complete, revealing a total of 7 significant anomalies spread across the investigation area. The pattern suggested a systematic effort to conceal evidence, with burial sites located in areas that would be difficult to find and unlikely to be disturbed by normal agricultural or construction activities. Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis indicated that the anomalies represented different types of concealment. Some appeared to be equipment caches, possibly containing vehicles or large containers. Others showed patterns consistent with structural remains, bunkers or storage facilities that had been filled in and camouflaged. Most significantly, one anomaly showed characteristics that suggested it might contain human remains. The discovery that captured everyone's attention was the largest anomaly, located in a depression that had once been a natural cave system. The radar indicated a sealed chamber approximately 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. The metal signatures from this location were consistent with a military footlocker or storage container, and the depth suggested it had been buried with considerable effort and planning. Patrick Sullivan stood at the edge of the marked excavation site, looking down at the ground that might finally hold answers to questions that had haunted his family for 60 years. The archaeological survey had provided evidence that supported everything Michael's digital research had suggested. There had been a systematic effort to conceal evidence related to the missing soldiers and the Nazi treasure they had discovered. But the real test would come when Dr. Chen's team began the careful process of excavation, uncovering whatever had been deliberately hidden in the Bavarian soil 6 decades earlier. The excavation began at dawn on September 20th, 2005, with Dr. Chen's team working in carefully measured layers to preserve any evidence they might uncover. Patrick Sullivan sat in a folding chair at the edge of the dig site, watching every shovelful of dirt that emerged from the hole his money had made possible. At 76, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his eyes remained sharp and focused on the work that might finally answer the questions that had defined his entire adult life. The first 3 feet of soil came up easily, revealing nothing more than the accumulated debris of 60 years of forest growth. Leaves, small stones, and the occasional piece of rusted metal that could have come from anywhere filled the screens that graduate students used to sift through each bucket of earth. But at 4 feet down, the character of the soil changed dramatically. "We're hitting fill dirt," Dr. Chen announced, kneeling beside the excavation and examining the soil layers visible in the walls of the growing hole. This earth was moved from somewhere else and used to backfill this area. You can see the difference in color and composition. Someone definitely dug here and then covered their work. Michael Sullivan looked up from his laptop computer, where he was documenting each stage of the excavation with digital photographs and GPS coordinates. "How deep do you think it goes?" Dr. Chen consulted her notes from the ground-penetrating radar survey. "The anomaly extends to about 8 feet. We should be getting close to whatever was buried down there." The work continued methodically, with each bucket of soil being carefully sifted and examined before being set aside. Dr. Chen insisted on photographing the excavation from multiple angles every 6 inches of depth, creating a complete visual record that could be used as evidence if the discovery proved legally significant. Detective Inspector Mueller watched the process with professional interest, taking his own notes for the Bavarian State Criminal Police. At 6 feet down, the first piece of metal appeared. Dr. Chen brushed soil away from what looked like the corner of a metal container, exposing olive-drab paint that had been protected from corrosion by the dry soil and lack of oxygen. The graduate students worked more carefully now, using small brushes and dental tools to expose the buried object without damaging it. "It's definitely military, Doctor," Chen said, running her fingers along the exposed metal edge. "American military, based on the paint color and the construction. This looks like it might be a footlocker." Patrick Sullivan's heart began beating faster as more of the container became visible. The metal box was approximately 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep, exactly the dimensions of the standard U.S. Army footlockers that had been issued to soldiers during World War II. But what made everyone at the dig site stop working was what became visible when they cleared soil from one end of the container. Stenciled in white paint across the olive-drab metal, still clearly legible after 60 years underground, were the words PFCJ. Sullivan 42 NDNF. Div. Below that, in smaller letters, was Jimmy's service number and what appeared to be a date, APR 1945. Patrick Sullivan stood up from his chair and walked to the edge of the excavation, looking down at his brother's name emerging from the Bavarian soil. Klaus Weber put a steadying hand on Patrick's shoulder as the old man stared at physical evidence of Jimmy's presence in this remote forest location. After 60 years of questions and theories and frustrating dead ends, they had found something that belonged definitively to Private First Class James Sullivan. Dr. Chen continued the careful excavation around the footlocker, documenting its position and orientation before attempting to remove it from the ground. The container appeared to be completely sealed, with military tape wrapped around the edges where the lid met the body of the footlocker. The tape showed no signs of deterioration, suggesting that the container had been effectively waterproof and airtight since the day it was buried. "The preservation is remarkable," Dr. Chen observed as she photographed the sealed footlocker from every angle. "The conditions down here have been perfect for preventing corrosion and decay. Whatever's inside this container should be in excellent condition." The footlocker was heavy, requiring 4 people to lift it carefully from the excavation and place it on a tarp beside the dig site. Detective Inspector Mueller examined the container closely, noting the military markings and the apparent authenticity of the materials and construction. "This is consistent with American military equipment from the 1940s, he confirmed. "The serial numbers and markings all appear genuine." Michael Sullivan ran his hands along the sealed edges of his grandfather's footlocker, amazed by the physical connection to a man he had never met, but whose disappearance had shaped his entire family's history. "Do we open it here, or do we take it somewhere else?" Dr. Chen considered the options carefully. Opening the footlocker at the dig site would allow them to document its contents in their original context, but the remote location lacked the controlled environment and security that might be necessary if the container held evidence of war crimes or other sensitive materials. "I think we should transport it to the university laboratory in Munich," she decided. "Professor Weber has arranged for us to use their facilities, and we'll have better lighting and documentation equipment there." Plus, if there are any legal implications from what we find inside, we'll want to make sure we follow proper evidence protocols. Patrick Sullivan looked at the sealed footlocker that contained the first tangible evidence of his brother's fate that the family had ever discovered. After 6 decades of searching, they had found something that Jimmy had deliberately hidden in the Bavarian forest, something important enough that he had taken the time to bury it carefully and mark its location before whatever had happened to him occurred. The footlocker represented both an ending and a beginning. It was the culmination of 60 years of investigation by 3 generations of the Sullivan family, but it was also the start of what they hoped would be the final chapter in the mystery of Jimmy's disappearance. Whatever secrets lay inside the sealed container would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted them for their entire lives. The conservation laboratory at the University of Munich had been cleared of all other projects to accommodate the opening of Jimmy Sullivan's footlocker. Dr. Chen had insisted on controlled conditions, stable temperature, low humidity, and sterile tools to prevent contamination of whatever evidence they might discover inside. Patrick Sullivan sat in a chair positioned where he could see everything, but wouldn't interfere with the scientific documentation that was required. Klaus Weber operated a video camera while Dr. Chen carefully cut through the military tape that had sealed the footlocker for 60 years. Detective Inspector Mueller observed from a corner of the room, ready to take custody of any evidence that might be relevant to criminal proceedings. Michael Sullivan worked at a computer station, prepared to scan and digitize any documents they discovered. The tape came away in long strips, still flexible despite its age, testament to the quality of materials the Army had used in 1945. Dr. Chen lifted the lid slowly, revealing contents that had been perfectly preserved in the airtight environment Jimmy had created when he sealed the container and buried it in the Bavarian forest. The first items visible were personal effects that any soldier might have saved. Letters from home, still in their original envelopes, arranged in neat stacks and secured with rubber bands that had deteriorated but still held together. Photographs were wrapped in oiled cloth, including the picture of Jimmy's family that Patrick remembered seeing in his mother's collection, and several images of Jimmy with his squad mates that the family had never seen before. But underneath the personal items, Dr. Chen discovered something that made everyone in the laboratory lean forward with interest. Jimmy had created a comprehensive documentation system, using a bound ledger book and loose sheets of paper to record detailed information about something he had obviously considered extremely important. "This is remarkable, Doctor," Chen said as she carefully lifted the ledger from the footlocker. "Your brother was conducting a systematic investigation of his own. Look at this organization and attention to detail." The ledger contained page after page of careful handwriting, documenting what Jimmy described as Nazi loot recovered from Dachau operation. Each entry included dates, locations, descriptions of items, and estimated values. Jimmy had sketched maps showing the locations of hidden caches, drawn detailed diagrams of bunkers and storage facilities, and recorded conversations he had overheard between American officers about the disposition of recovered treasure. Patrick Sullivan looked over Dr. Chen's shoulder as she turned the pages of his brother's ledger, reading entries that revealed Jimmy's growing concern about corruption among his own command structure. Officers talking about retirement funds. Read one entry. Lieutenant Cole Morrison said some of this stuff will never make it into official reports. Sergeant Patterson agreed that certain items could disappear without questions being asked. The sketches and maps were particularly detailed, showing the locations of at least 6 different hiding places where Nazi officials had concealed stolen art, gold, and currency before fleeing the advancing Allied forces. Jimmy had apparently spent considerable time exploring these sites, documenting their contents and taking measurements that would allow them to be relocated later. More disturbing were Jimmy's notes about specific American personnel he suspected of stealing recovered treasure. The young soldier had been keeping track of which officers had access to the hidden caches, which ones were present when items were cataloged, and which ones seemed to have more money than their military pay could account for. He had created a web of connections that suggested systematic theft by multiple people in positions of authority. "This is incredible," Klaus Weber said as he reviewed photographs Jimmy had somehow managed to take of the hidden treasure caches. The black and white images showed rooms filled with artwork, stacks of gold bars, and containers of jewelry that represented the stolen wealth of thousands of Nazi victims. "Your brother documented millions of dollars in recovered assets that never appeared in official records." The most significant discovery was a letter Jimmy had written but never sent, addressed to his commanding general and dated April 29th, 1945, just one day before his disappearance. The letter detailed his suspicions about theft of recovered Nazi treasure and requested a formal investigation into the activities of specific officers in his unit. "I believe there is systematic theft of property that belongs to the victims of Nazi crimes," Jimmy had written. "American officers are stealing from dead Jewish families and concentration camp victims. This cannot be allowed to continue. I am prepared to testify about what I have seen and can provide documentation and evidence to support formal charges." Patrick Sullivan felt tears forming in his eyes as he read his brother's words. Jimmy had discovered evidence of war crimes being committed by his own command and had been preparing to expose the theft when he disappeared. The 19-year-old soldier from South Boston had been willing to risk his career and his relationships with fellow soldiers to ensure that justice was done for the victims of Nazi persecution. Dr. Chen continued cataloging the contents of the Footlocker, finding additional photographs, maps, and notes that Jimmy had accumulated during his investigation. The documentation was so comprehensive that it could have formed the basis for court-martial proceedings against multiple officers if Jimmy had lived to present his evidence to higher authorities. The final item in the Footlocker was a sealed envelope marked, "For Mary O'Connell, Boston, Massachusetts." Inside was a letter Jimmy had written to his girlfriend, explaining what he had discovered and expressing his fears about what might happen to him if his investigation became known to the officers he was planning to expose. "If something happens to me," Jimmy had written to Mary, "make sure someone investigates Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and the others. They're stealing from the dead, and I won't let them get away with it. I love you, and I'm sorry if this letter means I won't be coming home to marry you like we planned." The Footlocker had provided answers that the Sullivan family had been seeking for 60 years, but the truth was more painful than anyone had expected. Jimmy hadn't died in combat or been killed by retreating German forces. He had been murdered by his own command to prevent him from exposing their theft of Nazi treasure, assets that belonged to the families who had been murdered in concentration camps throughout Europe. Patrick Sullivan looked at the evidence spread across the laboratory table, and finally understood why his brother's case had been classified and transferred to intelligence agencies. The corruption Jimmy had discovered reached into the highest levels of the American military command, and the cover-up had been orchestrated to protect careers and reputations, rather than to serve justice for either Jimmy or the Nazi victims whose property had been stolen. The leather-bound diary was the smallest item in Jimmy Sullivan's Footlocker, but it proved to be the most revealing document Dr. Chen's team discovered. The diary contained entries spanning from Jimmy's arrival in Bavaria in early April 1945 through his final written words on April 29th, just one day before his disappearance. As Patrick Sullivan read his brother's handwriting for the first time in 60 years, a story emerged that was both heroic and tragic. The early entries documented Jimmy's growing horror at what American forces were discovering as they liberated Nazi concentration camps and uncovered evidence of systematic genocide. "Saw things today that I can't write about," Jimmy had recorded on April 12th. "Ma always taught me that people are basically good, but what happened here makes me question everything I thought I knew about human nature." But it was the entries from late April that revealed the full scope of what Jimmy had discovered and why he had felt compelled to document everything so carefully. On April 26th, Jimmy wrote about finding the first hidden bunker. "Stumbled across something big today during patrol. Hidden entrance covered with logs and brush. Inside is more wealth than I've ever seen. Gold bars stacked like firewood, paintings wrapped in cloth, jewelry boxes filled with wedding rings and family heirlooms. This isn't German government property. This is what the Nazis stole from their victims." Jimmy's entries showed that he had initially followed proper military procedure, reporting his discovery to Sergeant Patterson and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, but their reactions had troubled him immediately. Instead of celebrating the recovery of stolen property that could be returned to surviving families, his superiors seemed more interested in controlling access to the treasure and limiting knowledge of its existence. "Patterson told me to keep my mouth shut about what we found," Jimmy wrote on April 27th. "Said it was a matter of operational security, and that only authorized personnel would be involved in cataloging and securing the materials. But why wouldn't they want to document everything properly? These items belong to families who were murdered. They deserve to have their property returned." The diary entries revealed Jimmy's growing suspicion that his own officers were planning to steal portions of the recovered treasure. He documented conversations he had overheard, noting which officers seemed unusually interested in the hidden caches, and which ones had started talking about their post-war plans in terms that suggested access to significant financial resources. "Morrison and Patterson were talking about retirement investments today," Jimmy recorded on April 28th. "Morrison said the Army pay wasn't enough to live comfortably after the war, but that smart soldiers could find ways to improve their financial situation. Patterson laughed and said some things were worth more than their official value if you knew the right people to sell to." Jimmy's final entries showed a young man wrestling with the moral implications of what he had discovered. He understood that exposing the theft would destroy his relationships with fellow soldiers and potentially end his military career. But he also understood that remaining silent would make him complicit in crimes against the victims of Nazi persecution. "I keep thinking about the families who owned this stuff," Jimmy wrote. "Wedding rings from people who died in the camps, artwork from homes that were destroyed, gold that families saved for generations before it was stolen from them. How can I let American officers steal from the dead? How can I face myself if I don't do something?" The final entry in Jimmy's diary was dated April 29th, 1945, and revealed both his determination to expose the theft and his awareness of the danger he faced. The entry was longer than usual, suggesting that Jimmy understood it might be his last opportunity to record his thoughts. "I've decided to write a formal report to General Morrison about what I've seen," Jimmy had written. "I know Patterson and Lieutenant Cole. Morrison won't like it, but I can't stay quiet anymore. They think I'll keep quiet because I'm just a private, and they outrank me. But rank doesn't matter when it comes to doing what's right. I won't let them steal from the victims." The diary's final paragraph contained the cryptic reference that would become crucial to understanding Jimmy's fate. "Patterson pulled me aside today and said there might be consequences if I caused trouble for the unit. He said accidents happen in war, and that soldiers who don't follow orders sometimes don't make it home. I think they're planning something. If something happens to me, look for the truth where the eagles nest. I've hidden everything where the German eagles can't fly anymore." Patrick Sullivan read his brother's final words several times, trying to understand the meaning of the reference to eagles. Klaus Weber, who had been studying the diary over Patrick's shoulder, suddenly straightened up with recognition in his eyes. "The eagle's nest," Weber said slowly. "I think I know what your brother meant. There's an old German military bunker about 3 miles from where we found the Footlocker. During the war, it was called Adlerhorst, Eagle's Nest, because of the German military insignia carved above the entrance. American forces used it as a storage facility after the liberation." Dr. Chen looked up from photographing the diary pages. "You think Jimmy hid additional evidence there?" Weber nodded. "It would make sense. If he suspected his officers were planning to silence him, he would want to hide evidence somewhere they wouldn't think to look. An abandoned German bunker that had been converted to American use would be perfect." Patrick Sullivan closed his brother's diary and looked around the laboratory at the evidence that had finally explained Jimmy's disappearance. His 19-year-old brother had discovered theft of Nazi treasure by American officers and had been murdered to prevent him from exposing their crimes. The young soldier from South Boston had died trying to ensure justice for the victims of Nazi persecution, killed by the very people who were supposed to be fighting for justice and freedom. The diary had provided the answers Patrick had been seeking for 60 years, but it had also created a new obligation. Jimmy's final words suggested that additional evidence might be hidden at the location he called where the eagles nest. If that evidence still existed, it could provide the proof necessary to finally expose the crimes that had led to Jimmy's murder and ensure that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The investigation that followed the discovery of Jimmy's diary and documentation required a delicate balance between historical research and criminal investigation. Detective Inspector Mueller had contacted colleagues in Berlin who specialized in war crimes, while Dr. Chen reached out to historians who had been studying the systematic looting of Nazi treasure by both German officials and Allied personnel. What they uncovered was a conspiracy that had reached far higher into the American military command than anyone had initially suspected. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison's post-war life provided the first concrete evidence of the theft Jimmy had tried to expose. Military records showed that Morrison had returned to civilian life in 1946 with a modest pension and no significant personal wealth. But by 1950, he had purchased a large estate in Connecticut, started a successful import business, and was living at a standard that far exceeded what his military service should have provided. Sergeant Patterson's post-war trajectory was even more suspicious. The career soldier had retired in 1947 and immediately moved to Argentina, where he had purchased a ranch and established himself as a cattle exporter. Immigration records showed that Patterson had entered Argentina with documented assets that included valuable artwork and precious metals, items that he claimed were family heirlooms, but which bore suspicious resemblances to pieces described in Jimmy's documentation. Klaus Weber's research in German archives revealed additional evidence of the systematic theft. Banking records from Switzerland showed large deposits made by several American military personnel in 1945 and 1946 deposits that consisted primarily of gold and precious metals rather than currency. The amounts involved were staggering, representing millions of dollars in today's values, and confirming Jimmy's estimates of the treasure that had been stolen from Nazi victims. More disturbing was the evidence of how the cover-up had been orchestrated within the American military command. Dr. Chen's team discovered that the original investigation into Jimmy's disappearance had been deliberately sabotaged from the beginning. Reports had been falsified, witnesses had been intimidated into silence, and physical evidence had been destroyed or classified to prevent independent review. Captain Hayes, the Criminal Investigation Division officer who had conducted the original investigation, had filed a preliminary report that raised serious questions about Jimmy's disappearance and recommended further investigation into the activities of his commanding officers. But that report had been suppressed by higher command and replaced with the sanitized version that concluded Jimmy had probably died in combat. The suppressed report, discovered in recently declassified intelligence files, revealed that Hayes had suspected foul play from the beginning. He had documented inconsistencies in the statements provided by Morrison and Patterson, had noted the suspicious timing of Jimmy's disappearance relative to his discovery of the treasure cache, and had recommended that both officers be subjected to detailed financial investigations. Private Sullivan's disappearance coincides too closely with his discovery of significant Nazi assets to be coincidental, Hayes had written in his original report. The statements provided by his commanding officers contain discrepancies that suggest coordination rather than independent recollection. I recommend that this case be investigated as a potential homicide rather than a combat loss. But Hayes's recommendations had been overruled by Colonel James MacArthur, the division's intelligence officer, who had declared the case a matter of operational security and transferred it out of normal investigative channels. MacArthur's own post-war life showed the same pattern of unexplained wealth that characterized the other officers involved in the conspiracy. The cover-up had extended beyond simply falsifying reports about Jimmy's death. Evidence showed that several other soldiers who had discovered information about the stolen treasure had been transferred to different units, discharged early, or had suffered mysterious accidents that prevented them from testifying about what they had seen. The conspiracy had been systematic and thorough, designed to eliminate any witnesses who might expose the theft. Michael Sullivan's digital analysis revealed the scope of the financial crimes that Jimmy had died trying to expose. By cross-referencing asset records, immigration documents, and business filings, he estimated that the officers involved in the conspiracy had stolen between $15 and $20 million worth of Nazi treasure, money that should have been returned to surviving families or used to provide reparations to Holocaust survivors. The human cost of the cover-up extended far beyond Jimmy's murder. Thousands of families who had lost relatives in the Holocaust never recovered family heirlooms, wedding rings, and other precious items that had been stolen by the Nazis and then stolen again by American officers. The theft had denied these families both their property and the closure that might have come from recovering items that connected them to murdered relatives. Patrick Sullivan read through the evidence of the conspiracy with a mixture of vindication and grief. His 60-year search for answers had finally revealed the truth about his brother's fate, but the truth was more painful than he had ever imagined. Jimmy hadn't died fighting Germans or been killed by retreating Nazi forces. He had been murdered by his own commanding officers to prevent him from exposing their crimes against the very people the Allies had fought to liberate. The investigation had revealed not just a criminal conspiracy but a moral failure that reached into the highest levels of the American military command. Officers who had sworn to uphold justice and protect the innocent had instead chosen to profit from the suffering of Holocaust victims, and they had murdered a young soldier who had tried to stop them. But Jimmy's documentation had finally provided the evidence necessary to expose their crimes, even if justice had come 60 years too late. The Pentagon conference room where the meeting took place in December 2005 had hosted thousands of briefings over the decades, but few had addressed crimes that were 60 years old. General Patricia Williams, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, sat across from Patrick Sullivan and listened as he presented evidence that would force the military to confront one of its most shameful cover-ups from World War II. The Army's initial response to the Sullivan family's revelations had been predictably bureaucratic. Spokesmen had issued carefully worded statements, acknowledging the family's concerns, while emphasizing that most of the principals in the case were deceased and that any crimes would be well beyond any statute of limitations. But the comprehensive nature of Jimmy's documentation and the systematic pattern of corruption it revealed made dismissal impossible. By 2005, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been dead for 15 years, having lived a comfortable retirement funded by stolen Nazi treasure. Sergeant Patterson had died in Argentina in 1987, never returning to the United States after his suspicious emigration following the war. Colonel MacArthur, who had orchestrated the cover-up from his intelligence position, had passed away in 1992 after a distinguished post-war career that had included service in Korea and Vietnam. The men who had murdered Jimmy Sullivan and stolen from Holocaust victims had lived full lives and died peacefully, never facing justice for their crimes. But their deaths did not diminish the importance of acknowledging what they had done, or the need to provide answers to the families they had victimized. General Williams reviewed the evidence that Patrick Sullivan and Dr. Chen had compiled, examining Jimmy's diary, the photographs of stolen treasure, and the documentation of the systematic cover-up that had concealed the crimes for 6 decades. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of corruption that reached far higher into the military command structure than anyone had previously suspected. "Mr. Sullivan," General Williams said, looking across the table at the elderly attorney who had spent 30 years searching for answers about his brother's fate, "I want to apologize on behalf of the United States Army for the failures that led to your brother's death and the subsequent cover-up that denied your family the truth for so many years." The formal apology was followed by the announcement of a comprehensive investigation into the activities of American forces involved in treasure recovery operations throughout occupied Germany. The investigation would be conducted by the Army's Criminal Investigation Command in cooperation with the FBI and international law enforcement agencies, with a mandate to identify other cases where American personnel had stolen recovered Nazi assets. Patrick Sullivan accepted the apology with the dignity that had characterized his long search for justice, but he also made clear that symbolic gestures were not enough. "General," he said, "my brother died trying to ensure that stolen property was returned to the families of Holocaust victims. The very least the Army can do is honor his sacrifice by making sure that happens now." The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the conspiracy that Jimmy had died trying to expose. Documents discovered in recently opened archives showed that the theft of Nazi treasure by American personnel had been far more extensive than previously acknowledged. Conservative estimates suggested that hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets had been diverted into private hands rather than being returned to their rightful owners or used for Holocaust reparations. More significantly, the investigation revealed that the cover-up of Jimmy's murder had been part of a broader pattern of concealing crimes committed by American personnel in occupied Europe. The classification of documents, the transfer of cases to intelligence agencies, and the intimidation of witnesses had been systematic policies designed to protect the reputation of the American military rather than to serve justice. The Army's formal acknowledgement of Jimmy's case established important precedents for other families seeking information about missing relatives and suspicious deaths during the post-war period. The Department of Defense created new procedures for reviewing classified cases and established a victim assistance program to help families navigate the complex bureaucracy of military records and investigation. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Patrick Sullivan's long search for justice was the recognition that Jimmy's moral courage had been vindicated by history. The young soldier from South Boston who had been willing to risk everything to protect the victims of Nazi persecution was finally acknowledged as a hero who had died defending the principles that America claimed to represent. Dr. Chen's archaeological team worked with international organizations to locate and recover additional caches of stolen Nazi treasure based on Jimmy's documentation. Several significant discoveries were made, leading to the return of family heirlooms and artwork to surviving relatives and Holocaust memorial organizations. Patrick Sullivan lived to see his brother's name added to memorials honoring soldiers who had died fighting corruption and defending justice. Jimmy's story became part of the curriculum at military academies, where it was used to teach officers about the importance of moral courage and the dangers of allowing criminal behavior to go unchallenged. The investigation also led to changes in how the military handled the recovery of stolen assets in subsequent conflicts. New protocols were established to ensure transparency and accountability in the handling of recovered property, and oversight mechanisms were created to prevent the kind of systematic theft that Jimmy had discovered in Bavaria. Patrick Sullivan was 76 years old when he finally learned the complete truth about his brother's fate. The revelation that Jimmy had been murdered by his own officers was painful, but it was overshadowed by the knowledge that his brother had died trying to do what was right. Jimmy Sullivan had been a 19-year-old soldier who had understood that justice mattered more than personal safety, and his sacrifice had finally been acknowledged by the institution that had once tried to conceal his murder. The truth had taken 60 years to emerge, but justice delayed was still justice served. The abandoned German bunker that Klaus Weber had identified as Adlerhorst sat hidden beneath 60 years of overgrowth, its entrance barely visible through the tangle of vines and fallen timber that had accumulated since 1000 945. The concrete structure had been built into a hillside, about 3 miles from where Jimmy's footlocker was discovered, positioned to provide a commanding view of the valley while remaining concealed from aerial observation. Dr. Chen's team approached the site with the same methodical care they had used for the original excavation, but with heightened expectations based on Jimmy's final diary entry. The phrase, "where the eagle's nest," had led them to this location, and the reference to "where the German eagles can't fly anymore" suggested that Jimmy had hidden something significant inside the abandoned military installation. Patrick Sullivan walked slowly up the hillside toward the bunker entrance, using a walking stick to navigate the uneven ground. At 77 years old, he had lived most of his life wondering about his brother's fate, and now he was potentially minutes away from finding Jimmy's remains and laying the questions to rest forever. The bunker's steel door had been welded shut by American forces after the war, but decades of weather had corroded the metal enough that Dr. Chen's team could cut through it with portable equipment. Inside, their flashlights revealed a chamber that had been stripped of its original German military equipment, but showed signs of subsequent American use. What they found in the deepest section of the bunker confirmed Jimmy's courage and validated Patrick's 60-year search for the truth. In a natural cave that extended beyond the original German construction, carefully wrapped in military canvas and positioned where they would be protected from moisture and temperature changes, were the remains of Private First Class James Sullivan. Jimmy had been buried with military precision, his body positioned respectfully and his dog tags placed on his chest, along with the rosary beads his mother had given him before he shipped out to Europe. Beside his remains was a final note, written in Jimmy's handwriting and sealed in a waterproof container. "If someone finds this, tell my family that I died trying to do what was right," the note read. "The men who killed me are stealing from the families of people who died in the concentration camps. Don't let them get away with it. Make sure the treasure goes back to where it belongs. Tell Ma and Mary that I love them and that I'm sorry I won't be coming home." The discovery of Jimmy's remains allowed the Sullivan family to finally bring him home after 61 years. The funeral at Arlington National Cemetery in September 2006 was attended by hundreds of people, including Holocaust survivors whose families had benefited from the recovery of stolen Nazi treasure that Jimmy's documentation had made possible. General Williams delivered the eulogy, acknowledging Jimmy's moral courage and the Army's failure to protect him from the corruption he had tried to expose. "Private Sullivan died defending the principles that our nation claims to represent," she said. "His sacrifice reminds us that integrity and moral courage are more important than rank or personal advancement." The flag that draped Jimmy's coffin was presented to Patrick Sullivan, the last surviving member of the family that had never stopped searching for answers. Patrick held the folded flag and thought about his mother Margaret, who had died still believing that Jimmy would somehow come home. She had been right in a way, Patrick realized. Jimmy had finally come home. The James Sullivan Foundation, established with funds recovered from the investigation into the Nazi treasure theft, became a resource for other families seeking information about missing servicemen. The foundation provided funding for archaeological investigations, legal assistance for families navigating military bureaucracy, and support for researchers studying cases of soldiers who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The recovered Nazi treasure, valued at over $40 million, was distributed to Holocaust memorial organizations and surviving families according to Jimmy's documentation. Wedding rings were returned to children of murdered parents. Artwork was placed in museums dedicated to preserving the memory of Nazi victims. Gold and currency were used to fund educational programs about the Holocaust and the importance of moral courage in the face of injustice. Michael Sullivan continued his grandfather's work through the foundation, using modern technology to investigate cases of missing soldiers from conflicts around the world. The database he had created to solve Jimmy's case became a model for how families could coordinate their searches and share information across different wars and different countries. Patrick Sullivan lived another 4 years after Jimmy's funeral, spending his final days working with the foundation and sharing his family's story with students and researchers. He died peacefully in 2010, knowing that his brother's sacrifice had finally been acknowledged and that Jimmy's mission to return stolen property to Holocaust victims had been completed. The story of Private First Class James Sullivan became required reading at military academies and leadership schools, where it was used to teach officers about the importance of moral courage and the responsibility to protect those who report wrongdoing. Jimmy's example inspired a generation of military personnel to understand that doing the right thing sometimes required standing up to authority and risking personal consequences. In the end, Jimmy Sullivan's disappearance in the Bavarian forest had led to one of the most significant recoveries of stolen Nazi treasure in history and had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the American military. In Command. The 19-year-old soldier from South Boston had achieved something that eluded many people who lived much longer lives. He had made a difference that lasted long after his death. Jimmy Sullivan had vanished in 1945, but his legacy of integrity and moral courage had finally come home.